Dr. Katharine Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist and an endowed chair and distinguished professor in the Department of Political Science at Texas Tech. She's also the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy and, honestly, one of the best communicators of the climate crisis on the planet. And she's the author of the brand new book, Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World. Dr. Hayhoe, welcome to the Climate Pod.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, so much of Saving Us is about connecting the dots of what you care about to how it will be affected by climate change. So let's begin with your story. What was it that first got you motivated to care about climate change?
So growing up, I learned about climate change in school, along with other environmental issues, biodiversity loss, deforestation, air pollution. And so I thought of these issues as issues that environmentalists cared about and environmentalists wanted to fix. But if the rest of us did not consider ourselves to be environmentalists, we just wished them well, right? Like that was sort of their job. But in university, I was studying astronomy and physics, and I was planning to be an astrophysicist. And I was almost all of the way through my undergraduate degree when I needed an extra class. So I looked around and I saw this brand new class in climate science. I thought, well, that looks interesting. Why not take it? So I took it and I was completely shocked by three things. First of all, I was shocked to find out that climate science is the exact same physics that I've been learning in physics and astronomy. I don't know what I thought it was, but I didn't think it was that. The second thing that really surprised me was the fact that climate change is urgent. It's already here and now. It's no longer a future or distant issue. But what really changed my life was learning that climate change is not only an environmental issue. It is, of course, but climate change is also a health issue. It's an issue of resource scarcity. It affects the economy and national security. And most of all, climate change disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. So if you look at the United Nations, very basic sustainable development goals, no poverty, no hunger, access to clean water, basic health care, quality education, gender equity. And then down at number 13, you have climate change. But I don't think climate change should even be on that list at all, because the only reason we care about it is because it affects everything else that's already at the top of the United Nations priority list, my personal priority list, your priority list, whatever it is. So I realized, okay, here we've got climate change, which is, as the US military now calls it, a threat multiplier. We can't fix anything that's wrong with the world if we don't fix climate change first. It's like a hole in the bucket. You're pouring all of your money and effort and time and everything into this bucket, and there's this hole, and the hole is getting bigger and bigger, and the hole is climate change. You have to fix the hole. So I thought to myself, well, it's so urgent, surely we'll fix it soon. Why don't I do everything I can to help in study climate science and do policy relevant science? And when we're done, I'll go back to astrophysics. That was a very long time ago.
Well, how have you seen the conversation around global warming change over the course of your career?
I've seen it change significantly. Now, first of all, it changed for the worst, because I got into this in the mid-90s, and around then it was just starting to become polarized. Back in the mid-90s, Gallup was starting to poll people on global warming, and Republicans and Democrats were giving about the same answers on how concerned they were and whether it was real and whether it was a big deal. So at the beginning, it wasn't politically polarized. And of course, now it's the number one most politically polarized issue in the whole country. It's been that way for 10 years. So it was a very unpleasant surprise to me when I first ran into what is now every day. I mean, I get attacked every single day on social media now. But when I first ran into people saying it's not real, it's just a natural cycle, it's only volcanoes, and even worse, you scientists are just making it up to line your pockets with government grants. That was a complete shock to me, because I thought, a thermometer isn't Democrat or Republican. It doesn't give you a different answer depending on how you vote. And today, of course, 20 years on, today, we know that a hurricane doesn't knock on your door and ask you who you voted for in the last political election before it floods your house, right? And a wildfire doesn't ask, what party are you registered to vote for before it burns down your house. So that was something that I noticed that happened right when I came into the field. And it was so discouraging, because it's gotten to the point now where the number one predictor of whether you agree with simple facts that we've known since the 1800s, that Digging up and burning coal and gas and oil produces heat-trapping gases that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. We have literally known those things since the 1800s. The number one reason why, or predictor of whether you agree or not, is simply where you fall in the political spectrum. So I have lived through that whole development. But what I'm seeing today does give me some hope, because I am seeing that people are starting to realize, and this is what I really hope the book will help people see, is that whoever you are, you could be a business person, you could be conservative, you could be young, you could be old, you could be a person of faith, you could be a humanist or an atheist. You could enjoy shooting, you could enjoy fishing, you could enjoy hiking, you could enjoy birding, you could love food, you could love beer, you could be a teetotaler, you could be a parent, you could not be a parent. Whoever you are, literally, whatever is already at the top of your priority list today, it is being affected by climate change. Not will be, is. And here's the corollary. That means that you are already the perfect person to care about climate change. You don't have to become someone other than who you are. You don't have to leave the tribe that you're in. You don't have to change some fundamental aspect of yourself. You are already the perfect person to care about climate change. And you know what? Acting on climate will help you express what you care about in an even more genuine way. It is who you are. If you are a mom, you would do anything to protect your child's future. Well, climate change threatens your child's future. So as a mom, that's part of what motivates me. As a Christian, as a person of faith, I believe that we are to be recognized by our love for others. We are to care for those less fortunate than us. And this basic tenet is not just unique to Christianity. We see it in every major world religion. If we were living that out, how different would the world look? So whoever we are, if we're a winter athlete who cares about snow, and that's part of what I am too, we care about climate change, and there's something we can do. And that begins with using our voice to talk about it.
Yes, you wrote in the book, and I've heard you say this many times, that one of the most important things you can do is talk about climate change. But why do you think most people don't talk about climate change more often?
Well, first of all, we really don't talk about it. I mean, results from the Yale program on climate communication show that only about 35% of people even hear somebody else talk about it occasionally, let alone talk about it themselves. And I'm part of an organization called Science Moms, which is about activating moms to raise their voices on behalf of their kids for climate action. And a new poll that they just did last week, I think, showed that only 14% of people are talking about climate change. So we aren't doing it. Why not? A big reason is because we're worried about what's going to happen if we do. We're afraid we're going to get in an argument with someone. We're afraid we're just going to be depressed about it. And we feel like, I don't know what to say. I'm not a scientist. What am I supposed to say about ice cores and atmospheric heat trapping gases and polar bears? So we don't know what to say. We don't know how to say it. We're afraid of the outcome. So what do we do with all of this risk and uncertainty around talking about climate change? We just don't. And ironically, talking about it is the very thing that we need to be doing, because that's what tips over the first domino in the long chain of climate action.
Well, what are ways that will help people be more effective when talking to others who might not be convinced of the climate science or motivated to act?
In Saving Us, I have so many stories of people who've had conversations. I have some conversations that went badly. We've all had those, and we can learn from them. But I also have lots of stories about conversations that went well. And here's what they all had in common. They didn't begin by arguing or disagreeing. They began with something that we agree on. And if you don't know what you agree with somebody on, then ask them questions and listen to the answers. Don't just immediately launch in. After talking with people, I've learned that we both knit, or we both love food, or we're both parents, or we both visited a certain place, or we both love skiing. So figure out a way to begin the conversation that you agree with people, not that you disagree with them. And if you're really still stymied, ask a question like, say, hey, have you lived here for a long time? Have you noticed some really crazy weather? Or, we hear a lot about climate change in the news. How worried are you about it from a scale from 1 to 10? People like answering open-ended questions. But when you say things like, why aren't you worried about climate change? Or why aren't you? That comes with an implicit side of judgment. I don't know about you, but when somebody asks me, why aren't you? I just want to dig in my heels. I'm like, hey, I'm doing what I'm doing because I've thought about it and I have good reasons for living the way I live. And so many of our conversations sort of have that implicit sort of undertone of judgment of you're ignorant or you're wrong, or sometimes even you're bad. But when we begin the conversation with something that we agree with people on rather than disagree, we're respecting who they are and we're elevating it. And then connect the dots to what they already care about. I'm absolutely convinced that if you looked at the top priorities on anybody's list, anybody would have something up there that is directly connected to climate change. In fact, most of those things are connected to climate change. So for me personally, I'm a scientist. So obviously scientists care about climate change, but I'm also a mom. Again, I would do anything for my child's future and it's being affected by climate change. I love the outdoors and sports, especially winter sports. I need snow and ice for that. And that's decreasing as the planet warms. And most of all, I'm a Christian. And I truly believe that we have responsibility over every living thing on this planet to take care of it. And especially we are to care for those who are less fortunate than us, our sisters and our brothers right here, as well as on the other side of the world. So everything I am that's important to me, that is directly connected to climate change, to why I care and what I can do about it. So when we have these conversations with people, start with something we agree, connect the dots to why climate change matters, but don't end there. Because if we talk about a big problem, but we don't offer any way to fix it, then people are like, so why are you even telling me about this? So in the book, and hopefully you would see this, the book is really a balance between, hey, it matters to all of us. To care about climate change, you only have to be one thing, and that is literally a human living on planet Earth. And if you are that, then climate change matters. You care, even if you didn't realize it. But the other half of the book is this: we can fix it. And that is a huge part of the message, because otherwise, if there's a big problem, but I don't think I can fix it, what am I supposed to do? And why are you even telling me about it? We need to know that our future is in our hands, that some of the impacts of climate change are here today, but the very worst impacts are not yet here and they can be avoided. How? By cutting our emissions, by using our resources more efficiently, by sucking carbon out of the air and putting it back in the soil and in the biosphere where we want it. And how do all of these actions begin? They begin with people using their voices to advocate for change wherever they are, where you work, where you live, where your kid goes to school, where you worship, where you go for fun. Every single one of us has a role to play. And to be honest, that's the only way the world ever has changed before, is when ordinary people use their voices to advocate for change.
We argue in the book that it's not a lack of information about the science that's driving many to disregard or even attack the evidence that humans are warming the planet. It's the politicization of the issue. So why do you think climate science has become so politicized?
Well, to say that, I actually cite social science research. Being a scientist, I always want to cite the research. And it's Dan Kahan from Yale University who showed that the higher people's science intelligence, which is sort of a measure of how good people are at data and statistics and interpreting them, the higher someone's science intelligence, if they are conservative, politically conservative, the more likely they are to reject climate change. Whereas the higher their science intelligence, if they're a liberal Democrat, the more likely they are to accept it. So we often think, oh, well, if somebody doesn't think climate is changing or humans are responsible, they're just not educated or they're stupid. No. In fact, the smarter we are, the better we are at out-arguing the devil, so to speak. The better we are at motivated reasoning. And in my book, I tell about how, my husband has a PhD and I have a PhD. So when we argue, there are peer-reviewed papers involved in, do you eat that yogurt or not? Literally. We are not finding those papers to prove the other person right. We are finding them to prove ourselves right. That is motivated reasoning. And the smarter we are, the better we are at it. So that explains why, when it comes to issues that we are emotionally invested in, that more facts are not going to change people's minds, facts about the science. Now, don't get me wrong. First of all, facts are important. They explain how the world works. You could say, I don't believe in gravity, but if you step off the cliff, you're going down, whether you believe in gravity or not, right? And then with neutral issues, like, say there's a new discovery about ants or a new discovery about black holes, and the scientists tell people the facts. You might not understand the facts, but most of us would be like, sure, I accept them. No argument. We wouldn't turn around and say that those scientists are receiving money from Big Ant to come up with those findings. Or, those scientists are in the pay of black holes that have, promised them something to say this about them. That wouldn't even cross our minds, would it? So why does it come up all the time with climate scientists? It's because climate change has been deliberately polarized. It has been carefully, cold-bloodedly, and deliberately polarized. By who? By everyone who has every reason to keep us addicted to fossil fuels as long as possible. Who are those people? Well, 90 corporations are responsible for 2/3 of heat-trapping gas emissions since the dawn of the industrial era. And if you go to Wikipedia and you look at a list of the richest companies in the world, most of the ones in the top 10, 20, and 30, the majority of companies made their money off extracting, processing, selling, or building things that burn fossil fuels. So Merchants of Doubt is a really illuminating book. And you've probably had Naomi on your podcast before, haven't you?
Yes.
Yes. Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway wrote Merchants of Doubt. It is also a movie that you can watch. And I actually recommend both of them because they sort of cover it from different angles. And it lays out how big corporations hired merchants of doubt. They followed in the pathways of big tobacco, right? Who had convinced people that, smoking's great for your health. There's no problem with smoking. And they took their playbook and they reproduced it and they magnified it. And they deliberately sowed doubt through op-eds, through fake experts, through cherry picking, through dark money foundations to harass and intimidate scientists and through politicians. They knew that to stop climate action, you have to have politicians to stop it. And so not only did they invest in sowing the seeds of doubt on already fertile ground, because there was already a tension between science and faith in the US that they exploited masterfully. But they also said, hey, let's support politicians. And here's the really horrifying thing. I haven't seen the statistic for the last election, but in the one before that, where Clinton ran against Trump, moving into the finals, the single politician who had received the most support from the fossil fuel industry was Ted Cruz, who is well known for his climate denial. Number 2 was Donald Trump. And number 3 was Hillary Clinton. So fossil fuels and their power and their wealth have permeated our entire society. But the good news is that is changing. So a lot of the big companies are being pressured to set net zero goals, to invest in green and clean energy. They are being pressured by people who are pressuring them from the outside. They are being pressured from the inside by stakeholders like engine number 1 with Exxon. They're being pressured by people in their field, by people, by some competitors. And how did all of this begin? How did any of this begin? It began when people started using their voices. It began when scientists used their voices to calculate which 90 companies were responsible for those 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. It began when amazing researchers like Naomi Oreskes began to research exactly what they had done to try to confuse the issue. It began when people started to picket outside their buildings and saying, hey, this has to change. It began when people in the industry said, you know what, things need to be different. It began when investors began to say, hey, I'm a shareholder and we need to move in a different direction. How does the world change? It changes when everybody, whoever they are, wherever they are, they use their voice where they are to advocate for change.
Well, a lot of those polarization tactics that you were talking about have also been seen around the conversation around COVID and vaccines and mask mandates. So as a climate scientist, what have you made of the conversation around the COVID vaccine?
So one of my favorite cartoons, and I say favorite in terms of Black humor, is, and you might have seen it, and people listening might have seen this cartoon too. You've got 2 physicians in white coats standing by a door that says COVID. And they say, well, surely if we just tell the American public the facts. And then over on the other side, you see these other scientists by a door that says climate change, and they're rolling on the ground laughing. We have tried to tell people the facts for decades. It was 1965 when scientists first warned a US president of the risks of climate change. And of course, that president was Lyndon B. Johnson. It's been 41 years since the IPCC released their first assessment report. It's been 39 years since the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was signed by every country in the world, promising to prevent dangerous human interference with the only home that we have, this planet. So we know that just piling on more scientific studies, while important, again, don't get me wrong, they're absolutely important because they tell us what's real, right? But that's not what's going to change people's minds. And so in the book, I actually start off, because of course I was writing the book during the pandemic, I start off by saying I watched with horror, but not with surprise, as coronavirus rapidly became one of the most politicized issues in the whole country, right up there with climate change. The simple facts of whether wearing a mask on our face to love our neighbor, to protect others who are more vulnerable, it became a political badge. The idea that getting a vaccine, which most of us have had many vaccines, most of us have had plenty of vaccines as a child, and even when we travel, we get vaccines depending on where we're going, yet somehow this vaccine became a political football. I was not surprised, but I was even more horrified because you hear stories of people who it is personal. I mean, they literally have COVID. They are literally in the hospital. Instead of saying goodbye to their family, they are arguing with the doctor over whether they actually have it or not. You have people, and I know some, who have lost their lives to COVID, and yet their family continues to just be careless in terms of masks and prevention and things and social distancing. It is absolutely heartbreaking to see the extent to which ideological polarization is causing all of us to make decisions that run directly counter to our own well-being. And you have to ask the question, if that's the case, who benefits? And unfortunately, who benefits is whoever benefits from keeping us apart. The reality is, and in my book, I try to say this in as many different ways as I can, the reality is what we have in common is far more than what divides us. We are humans living on this planet. We depend on it literally for the air we breathe and the water we drink and the food we eat and everything that we use. We all want a healthy economy. We all want a better future. We all want a safe place to live. We all want a better world for our kids. We all want this. Yet somehow we are being manipulated and deceived into driving ourselves farther and farther apart. And as I talk about in the book, it's happening on both sides. It isn't like one group of people has stayed in the middle and the other went to the one side. It's happening in both directions. And the sad thing is to fix what's wrong with the world, we have to come together. We can't do it unilaterally. But here's the thing. If we can connect on climate change, which is the #1 most politicized issue in the whole US, even with COVID, it's still up there. If we can connect on climate change, if we can figure out how to have constructive conversations, how to agree on why it matters and what we can do to fix it on climate change, what else might we be able to fix?
Well, your religion is really important to you and the work that you do. But you write about in the book that many white Christians are climate deniers in this country. So why do you think so many white Christians have refused to believe climate scientists?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So in the book, I highlight how white evangelical Protestants and white Catholics in the United States are consistently at the bottom of those who care the least about climate change. I should say they're at the bottom of those who care the most. So in other words, they care the least about climate change. And in the book, I say, I don't find it helpful to call people deniers or believers. I don't find it helpful to call them believers because too often climate change is painted as an alternate religion, as a false earth worshiping religion. I worship Father God, not Mother Earth, one church sign says. And climate change is just a religion, says Ted Cruz. What does that do? It makes people who already have a religion or belief system reject it because they're like, oh, well, I already have one. I don't need a new one. So it's been very cleverly manipulated into appearing as if it's a belief system, when in fact, it's simply what a thermometer is telling you. No belief required. And then I don't like the word denier because it draws a line in the sand, and it's too often applied to people who might be doubtful or he even might be cautious, and they lead with their questions, and immediately kind of the label of denier gets slapped on them. But of course, there are people who are dismissive. And in the book, I talk about the 6 Americas of global warming that Tony Lizerowitz and Ed Maybach put together. I think it's so useful. It shows that, you know what, well over 50% of us are alarmed or concerned. Well over 50%. And the book is definitely written for anyone who's alarmed and concerned and isn't activated. They feel like, where do you find hope? What am I supposed to do about this problem? I'm just one person. That's who the book is for. Then the third largest group is cautious. People who've heard about it and they're not quite sure how it affects them. And if it does affect them, what they're supposed to do about it. That's who the book is written for too. It explains why it matters and how we can all help. Then there's a tiny little group that's disengaged. They've been living under a rock the last 20 years. The book is for them too, because it says, hey, it matters, it's urgent, it's now. You can't be disengaged anymore if you're a human living on planet Earth. If you don't think you're a human and you don't think you're on planet Earth, you get a pass, but anybody else, this matters. Then we have 12% who are doubtful. And they're tough nuts to crack. With them, you know, really approaching it from a what is important to them, what matters to them. Let's begin with that. Let's bring it back to that. Let's bring in voices they might respect, military leaders, conservative leaders, faith leaders. Let's talk about really positive solutions. Like one of my favorite stories in the book is about John Cook's dad. Now you probably know John Cook, skeptical science. He created skeptical science, motivated in part by the fact that his dad was seriously doubtful. Every time he'd go home to dinner, his dad would be like, well, John, there's more polar bears now than there ever have been. So how can you say that the world is warming? So John goes on, gets a PhD in cognitive psychology, becomes a global expert in debunking misinformation. His cranky uncle videos on YouTube are just brilliant. If you haven't seen them yet, check them out. And he does them on COVID too, because it's all the same thing, right? Do you think any of that changed his dad's mind? No. What changed his dad's mind, who was highly doubtful, was when he helped his dad get solar panels. His dad started saving all kinds of money. His dad's identity was of being a fiscal, independent conservative. And the more money he saved on his solar panels, the more fiscal and independent he was. And so John says in the book that after a couple of years, he was talking with his dad and sort of, you know, in the course of conversation, his dad said, oh, global warming, you know, I've always thought that was true. And John was like, what? Not only did he completely do a 180, but he forgot that he even said it wasn't real. So that's how a doubtful has really, truly changed their mind. It's by getting them engaged on the solutions and helping them be part of the solutions, being a good guy instead of a bad guy. But then you have the dismissives, the 7%ers. And we all know a dismissive. We may have an uncle, we may have a coworker, we may be connected with somebody on Facebook. A dismissive cannot leave it alone. They are always posting or sharing or talking about it. And so we often dream when someone says, oh, there's this book that talks about how to have a conversation about climate change. You're like, oh, yes, I can finally sock it to that person I know. They will admit that, yes, climate change is real and I was right all along. Well, first of all, that's not really our goal. Our goal is saving us, not proving that we're right. And second of all, with dismissives, I truly believe, and I actually mean this, that it takes a miracle to change a dismissive's mind. And I personally don't think I'm in the miracle business, because a dismissive person literally cannot listen. They're incapable of listening to anything that they think might contradict something that they fear so badly. It's fear behind it. So I've experimented on social media where I've met a lot of dismissives, hundreds and probably even thousands of them every day. And I've realized that if somebody's dismissive, they literally cannot click a link. Like if they say, oh, it's just a natural cycle, and I say, no, it's not. Here's a global weirding episode that I've done, or here's a link to skeptical science. They cannot click it. I gave a talk the other day at the local Lions Club earlier this week. And it was a very short talk, but I knew my audience. I knew there'd be, doubtfuls, and I knew there'd be cautious. So I said, how do we know that it's not volcanoes? Because people always say one volcanic eruption produces more pollution than humans do in 30 years. So why would we say it's humans? So I literally said that, and then I explained why it isn't volcanoes causing us to warm, that volcanic eruptions actually cool the earth rather than warming it. And afterwards, a man came up to me, and here's how I knew he was dismissive. He came up and he said, first of all, he used fake experts. He said, well, a former NASA administrator has written a book talking about how it's all solar cycles, and here's the book. So number one, fake experts. And then he said, and I don't understand why you didn't tell people honestly that it's all volcanoes, because you know that one big volcanic eruption produces more pollution than 30 years of human emissions. Like, he literally said the same thing. And I said, sir, I said, did you not hear me? I literally said those words. And he said, no, I didn't hear you. And I don't think it was his fault. I think his psychology was blocking him. So the 7%ers, I think it takes a miracle, like literally an angel with tablets of stone saying global warming is real in foot-high letters of flame. I don't even think that would be enough to change their minds. But here's the good news. They may be loud. There may be a lot of them on social media, but they're only 7%. And you know what? For everybody else, from that 8% up to that 100%, we absolutely can have those constructive conversations. If we start with something that we agree on, we connect the dots, and then we show that there are solutions that they can get on board with.
We talk about psychological distance also as one of the reasons why people refuse to act. So what is psychological distance?
Oh, so that's something we are all prone to as humans. We all know how much we should be exercising, what we should be eating, how much money we should be saving. Yet most of us aren't. Why not? Psychological distance. We see problems like heart attacks or not having enough money saved for retirement or serious health issues. We see them as being distant in time, the future, not now. We see them often as being distant in space, like happening to people over there, but not here. We see them as being distant in relevance, like that's just not me. I mean, it could be their problem. It's not my problem. And we see problems as being abstract, X% heart risk rather than concrete, my arteries. We see psychological distance in spades with climate change. The Yale program in climate communication has those maps I referred to earlier that show us how often people talk about climate change. Well, when you look at those maps, you also see some other really amazing things, which is that most people say, yes, climate is changing. It will affect plants and animals, non-human species. It will affect future generations. It will affect people in developing countries. But will it affect you? That number drops precipitously. That is psychological distance. So there's a researcher at my own university, Texas Tech, his name is Chris Chu, and he studies psychological distance. And here's the amazing thing he's found. When we bring climate impacts close in terms of what is happening now versus the future, and what is happening here where we live, bigger wildfires out west, stronger hurricanes in the Gulf, more intense flooding up east. When we bring climate change here to where we live, instead of talking about what's happening on the other side of the world, not only does it decrease our psychological distance, it decreases our political polarization as well. Because we're connecting directly to our hearts over something that might matter to us. I know it's hard to imagine this, but it might matter to us even more than our politics.
Well, you write in the book that Texas has experienced 124 different billion-dollar extreme weather events, more than any other state in the US. But Texas's governor, like most Republican governors in America, hasn't really taken the threat of climate change seriously. So why don't you think that psychological distance theory is more evident in how Texas Republicans react to climate change?
Oh, well, psychological distance is evident in how they react to it. I mean, Texas is arguably the most vulnerable state in the whole country to climate impacts. Texas is also home to the oil and gas industry, which supports a lot of the politics in Texas. And Texas, though, is also number one in the US in terms of wind energy production, and it's already currently number two in solar. So Texas is changing, and in 10 years, it is going to look very different than it does now. But what we have right now is we have the inertia in the political system. The inertia in the political system is heavily weighted towards those who control the balance of power and wealth in this world. And it still is, at the global scale, that balance of power and wealth still belongs to the fossil fuel industry, and in Texas, even more so. So what we see is cities like the city of Houston has a climate action plan for adaptation, resilience, and meeting their Paris targets. The city of Dallas, its operations are already 100% powered by clean energy. Of course, Austin, they're often a leader in climate action. So below the level of the state, there are all kinds of amazing things happening in Texas. We have the biggest Army base in the US by land area, Fort Hood, and it is 43% powered by clean energy, saving taxpayers millions of dollars. So change is happening. I feel like if it can happen in Texas, it can happen everywhere. But as you can see, it is percolating up from the bottom. And what is going to be the last to change is our politics at the state and the national level. But how does politics change? It changes in a democratic society when people use their voice.
Well, you live in Texas, you experienced the cold weather earlier this year. I mean, what did you think about Governor Abbott and others' reactions to those extremely cold temperatures that hit Texas earlier this year?
Well, remember I said climate change is the most politically polarized issue in the US, and that's exactly what happened. As soon as the freeze happened, Governor Abbott seized the opportunity to leap onto national television and blame wind turbines. Now, of course, it didn't take very long to determine that wind turbines were only responsible for 13% of the power outage. The rest was mostly due to natural gas, and then a little bit due to nuclear as well. And not only that, but wind turbines run in Scandinavia and the Arctic all the time. How do they run there without freezing? It's because they have anti-freeze equipment on them. But because Texas is a deregulated or an unregulated energy grid, the producers were not required to spend a little bit of extra money to winterize the equipment when they installed it. So it is a regulatory issue and it's a fossil fuel issue, but that wouldn't suit the political agenda. So that's not what the governor said. Now, fast forward, unfortunately, to September, because that's how long it takes scientists to crunch the numbers. And we now know that there was a direct connection to climate change as well. We now know that the stretching of the polar vortex, which is occurring because of a warming Arctic, the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. We know that the stretching of the polar vortex initiates events like the big Texas freeze. So even though this was worsened by climate change, of course it snowed in Texas before, it's, that actually happens, believe it or not. But climate change is worsening these extreme events. Clean energy has the ability to insulate us from the outages, and the most vulnerable low-income neighborhoods, the Black and brown communities in Texas, were the ones who went without power for the longest and who had the least resources to cope with being without power, living in places that were uninsulated. They might even have broken windows. They couldn't afford a generator. Even though it was like a trifecta of climate impacts and climate solutions, the fact that our risk is increasing, but that clean energy provides more stability and that the most vulnerable people are suffering, even still, that event was used as a political football to widen the gap between those who say, yes, this is real, we need to act, and those who don't. But you know what? Those who don't live on this planet. Their houses are equally vulnerable to freezes, hurricanes, wildfires. And so it just makes sense to say, you know what? I'm a human and I care about this issue. And we see people who do that. In Congress, there's a bipartisan climate solutions caucus. There's one in the Senate. You've got leaders like Bob Inglis, a former two-time Republican congressman, who's doing his very best to talk about free market solutions to climate change that conservatives can get on board with. So the world is changing. That giant boulder of climate change is not sitting at the bottom of the hill. It's already at the top of the hill, and it's already rolling down the hill, and it already has millions of hands on it. It just doesn't have enough. And that's where every single one of us comes in.
In August, the IPCC released its 2021 climate report. What were your main takeaways from that report?
So the IPCC reports are summaries of the literature. So in that sense, as a scientist, there was nothing in there that was surprising because it was based on what we have already seen before. But this report really did an outstanding job of synthesizing the science and presenting it in a way that was very clear. Their communication on this report was really impressive. They said, for example, that we know that it's warming faster than any time in the last 2,000 years of human history. And honestly, when you look further back, it's pretty much any time in human history. They also said very clearly that our future is in our hands. In the words of the IPCC report, the 1.5 degree report that they published in 2018, they said, every year matters. Every bit of warming matters. Every choice matters. Every action matters. And to me, that is the bottom line of the science. Some of the impacts are here today. We can't avoid them because they're already affecting us here. Some impacts are unavoidable because of all the carbon that's built up in the atmosphere. But we know without a shadow of a doubt, and I do this research myself personally, we know that our choices will determine our future, that the very worst can still be avoided. But we also know that the window of time is closing fast. And so that is why it is so essential that we act now, that we come together on this threat multiplier, because we sink or swim together.
Well, we have seen unprecedented heat waves, wildfires, hurricanes, floods in 2021. Unfortunately, we saw the same thing in 2020. What have you been thinking as these extreme weather events have devastated so many parts of the world?
Well, one of the new emerging areas in the scientific field is single event attribution. That's the idea that for a single event, a single set of wildfires or heat wave or hurricane or flood, we can put a number on how much worse climate change made it. So we already know that the heat wave that scorched Western North America this past summer was at least 150 times more likely because of climate change. We know that the floods that devastated Germany were more, I think it was something like 10 times more likely because of climate change. We know that Hurricane Harvey had 40% more rain because of climate change, and 3/4 of the economic damages were because of climate change making it bigger and stronger, or I should say stronger with more rainfall associated with it. So we're starting to put numbers on these things, and we're starting to see them everywhere. It used to be, 10 or 15 years ago that you would only really be personally experiencing the impacts of climate change if you lived, in Alaska or in a few specific places. But today it is everywhere. And it reminds me of the words of John Holdren, President Obama's science advisor. He said, we have three choices. We can mitigate, which is reduce our carbon emissions. We can adapt, build resilience to the impacts we can't avoid, or we can suffer. And we are going to do some of each, he said. The only question is how much, because the faster we cut our emissions, the less adaptation is required and the less suffering there will be. And what I see today is I see that suffering. That suffering is no longer a future issue. It is here and it is now. And that is why we must act.
Well, the fact that the next 3 decades are going to be the three hottest decades in human history, each hotter than the previous, and more suffering as a result, might lead a lot of people to despair. But saving us is about hope and healing. You're a climate scientist. How do you find hope when the evidence points to a potentially much worse future?
Well, I started to notice about 3 or 4 years ago that wherever I was speaking, whoever I was speaking to, whether it was a group of business people or a church group, fellow scientists, a senior citizen home, a community group, wherever I was speaking, I was starting to get the same question again and again. And that question was, what gives you hope? And I thought, well, a climate scientist is a good person to ask that, right? Because we see the science every day. We see every new study showing that climate is changing faster or to a greater extent than we thought, or affecting us more than we thought. So I turned the question around. I started to ask people themselves, what gives you hope? I started to collect their answers. And then I started to read the scientific literature on psychology and motivation and faith too, because of course, a lot of religions speak and a lot of faith talks a lot about hope too. And that ultimately, that question is why I wrote the book. And that's why the book is called Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World. Because without hope, we will be a self-fulfilling prophecy of doom. If we decide it's too late, it is, because we won't do anything to avoid the worst. But I know, and actually, ironically, the science does offer this hope, that our future truly is in our hands, that our decisions really do matter. So where do we find hope? We don't wait for it to come to us. If we just sit here and wait, hope will not arrive at us. If we just read the headlines, each news headline is more dire, more frustrating, more fearful than the one before. Hope will not find us. We have to go out and look for it. And that action of going out and looking for hope, of connecting with other people, of actually looking for good news, of sharing that good news with others, and most of all, of acting ourselves and connecting with others who are acting too, that is what gives us hope. There's a great quote from Greta Thunberg that I didn't use in the book, but I think it totally summarizes what the book is about. She says, don't look for hope, don't wait for hope, act. And when you act, Hope is all around you. So I want this book to help people realize that who they are is already the perfect person to care about climate change, exactly who they are. But I also want them to realize that you are, whoever you are, you're the perfect person to act. And when you act, beginning with using your voice to talk about why this matters and talk about some of the great solutions that are already happening, when you do that, that is where you will find hope. And the more we band together with each other, the more we find and join and support organizations that share our values, the more we collectively advocate for change in our school or our place of work or our city, the more change we actually see, and the more hope that gives us. It truly is a positive feedback cycle. And isn't that exactly what we need today?
It is. It is. And your work educating and inspiring so many people to not only learn more about climate change, but to also talk about it with others has been so critical to increasing awareness and in turn, taking steps toward real solutions to combat the worst aspects of the climate crisis. Your book, Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World, will be released on September 21st, and we will link to where our audience can buy the book in the show notes. We only scratched the surface during this conversation of what's in this book. I absolutely love the book. So if you're listening to this, please go buy Saving Us. I have been such a fan of yours for such a long time. So it was a true honor to be able to speak with you. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe, thank you for joining the Climate Pod.
Thank you so much for having me.